an administrative decision is approved. A demolition permit is signed. Heavy machinery waits in front of a 17-acre estate, 126 rooms, tens of thousands of antique objects. A structure built to last forever, lavish beyond belief, and too expensive to keep alive. Not war, not natural disaster, but cold numbers on a balance sheet push it to the edge. The annual operating costs exceed what any owner can reasonably carry. The government calls it a burden. Buyers call it a risk. In history, very few mansions disappear because they were poor. Mar-a-Lago nearly became one of them. If it had fallen, it would not have been just the loss of a house. It would have marked the end of a model of power where architecture, money, and privilege once moved together. This story is not about wealth. It is about the price required to keep a symbol alive. If you are interested in stories of legacy, power, and the hidden cost of luxury, like the video and subscribe to the channel. But to understand why Mar-a-Lago once stood on the brink, we have to go back in time, long before gilded walls, before this place even had a name on the map. Accident economy. When Palm Beach was still barely surviving, September Mot Ngin Tam Tram, Bay Moi Tam. Off the coast of Florida, a Spanish ship ran aground. Its name was Providencia. The hull broke apart on the sand. Cargo crates burst open. 20,000 coconuts spilled into the surf and washed ashore on a narrow, unnamed barrier island. At the time, this place was not Palm Beach. It was sand, scrub, brackish water, and mosquitoes. A few settler families lived here in crude wooden houses, floors raised on stilts to escape the tide. Fresh water came from rain barrels or had to be brought in from elsewhere. When storms arrived, roofs could be torn away overnight. When the wreck appeared, no one ran to rescue the crew. The sailors had already abandoned ship. People came because anything edible, sellable, or plantable had value here. Coconuts were split open on the beach for drinking water. Others were loaded onto rough carts and hauled away. Then they were planted in the sand like long-term bets with no guarantees. The coconut palm was not native to Florida, but it survived. And as the trees took hold, the shoreline began to change. Visitors from the north arriving in winter noticed first not hardship, but straight rows of palms, long shadows, and a tropical feeling. The name Palm Beach emerged as a kind of accidental branding born from a shipwreck. But a name did not make life easier. Through the 1880s, the area remained isolated. Supplies depended on small boats, arriving late, incomplete, or not at all. There were no real roads, only sand tracks. And even inside this place that sounded like paradise, a quiet boundary already existed. Not a line on a map, but a line in daily life. On the island, a handful of winter visitors stayed in a small hotel, ate rare hot meals, slept under mosquito nets. Across the lagoon, black laborers lived in a settlement known as sticks, crowded into small houses, doing the heavy work rarely mentioned, rowing back and forth, cleaning, repairing roofs, keeping everything presentable when guests arrived. Paradise here was not built with stone. It was held together by labor. And then the rhythm of the story changed. Spring, Mot Ngin Tam Tram, Chin Mui Ba. A 63-year-old man stepped onto the sand and looked at it like a blueprint. His name was Henry Morrison Flagler. He came from Ohio, shaped by America's industrial boom. He did not build his fortune in land or banking. He built it in oil. Standard Oil was an empire of refining and distribution, supplying kerosene, the fuel that lit millions of American homes before electricity became widespread. It controlled the chain from refinery to transport to market, a level of power that forced railroads and ports to comply. Flagler did not just have money. He had experience turning raw material into systems that scaled. He had already tested that formula in St. Augustine and won, building luxury hotels, then extending rail lines so wealthy guests could move directly from private rail cars into comfort without touching the harshness of Florida. Now he stood here, a place still poor, thinly settled, and unstable. But Flagler did not see poverty. He saw what every oil man looks for: infrastructure and control. The decision he was about to make would transform this strip of sand into the winter capital of American wealth and lock Palm Beach into a social structure it would carry for generations. And that leads to the real question. Who was this paradise built for, and who paid the price to keep it running? Flagler builds the stage February Motengendum Tram, Chinmoybon, Palm Beach, Florida. On February Moimont, the Royal Poinciana Hotel officially opens. Not a hotel, a complex, more than 1,000 rooms, stretching hundreds of meters along the lagoon, so large that, from a distance, it looks more like a factory than a resort. At the time, it is the largest wooden hotel ever built in Florida. But the Royal Poinciana is not what Flagler is really selling. He is selling a controlled experience. That same month, the Florida East Coast Railway reaches West Palm Beach. Private rail cars from New York and Boston begin arriving every winter. Wealthy guests step off the train, board small boats, and cross to the island without ever facing swamps, mud, mosquitoes, or heat. For the first time, Florida has a season. Not a rainy season, not hurricane season, but a social season. 8 to 12 weeks each year when wealthy Northerners migrate south together. Palm Beach is no longer a destination. It becomes an appointment. But a stage like this needs a backstage, and Flagler understands that immediately. As soon as construction begins, problems appear. Hundreds of workers need housing. Thousands of staff will be required to serve guests. Laundry, food supply, repairs, transport. Palm Beach cannot absorb it, and Flagler does not want it visible. So in Mot Ngin Tam Tram Chin Moi Bon, he looks across the lagoon and makes a quiet but structural decision. He plans West Palm Beach, not as a resort, but as an operating zone. Worker housing, warehouses, repair shops, supply docks. The people who maintain paradise will live here. They clean rooms, cook meals, wash linens, carry luggage, repair roofs, then row back and forth each day to keep the stage across the water spotless and silent. Palm Beach faces the ocean. West Palm Beach faces the work. Not by law, by design, and the design works. Guests arrive in greater numbers. In Motengin Tam Tram Chin Moi Sao, Flagler opens the Palm Beach Inn on the ocean front, later renamed the Breakers. For the first time, guests do not look toward the lagoon, but directly out to the Atlantic. A massive pier extends into the ocean. Steamships from Havana, Nassau, and Key West dock regularly. Palm Beach now attracts not only American wealth, but international elites. By the early 20th century, winter in Palm Beach becomes ritual. To miss it is to fall behind. And then Flagler makes his clearest statement. In Motengin Chin Tram Hai, he builds Whitehall, his own 55-room private residence. Imported marble. A great hall modeled after European palaces. A declaration without words. Palm Beach is no longer a frontier. It is an enclave of power. But a contradiction emerges. Flagler creates paradise while remaining obsessed with control. Guests are meant to see perfection and never the cost behind it. The larger the backstage grows, the brighter the stage must appear. And that perfection creates new pressure. Island land becomes scarce. Winter homes rise in quiet competition. Each owner wants to outdo the last. Palm Beach no longer needs a stage builder. It needs a leading character. Someone not content to winter here, but determined to leave a mark greater than anyone before. And this is where the story turns. Because once the stage is complete, what it waits for is not more guests. It is ambition. Post-power in a man's world. May Motengin Chin Tram Moi Bon, Battle Creek, Michigan. A 59-year-old man takes his own life inside his private estate. His name is Charles William Post. In a single morning, the food empire he built from nothing passes to his only daughter. Her name is Marjorie Merriweather Post. She is 27 years old. The inheritance is worth approximately $20 million, an extraordinary sum in Motengin Tram Moi Bon, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. But money is not the hardest part. Power is. In Motengin Tram Moi Bon, American women cannot vote. Boardrooms are male territory. Wall Street is not accustomed to taking orders from a young woman. Post enters a world where she owns the company but is not automatically seen as the one who runs it. This is the first contradiction. She has the capital. She holds controlling shares. But survival requires a different strategy. Post does not confront the system head-on. She controls it from within. In the years that follow, the Postum cereal company is quietly restructured. Acquisitions begin. No spectacle, no publicity, just results. By the early 1920s, Postum is no longer a cereal company. It is becoming a rapidly expanding food conglomerate. And then comes a decision that changes everything. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Hai Moi Chin. As the United States edges toward the Great Depression, Post makes a move many consider reckless. She acquires Birdseye, the pioneer of quick-freeze food technology, for roughly $22 million. Frozen food at the time is deeply mistrusted. Consumers doubt it. Grocers must invest in expensive freezers. The infrastructure barely exists. Even people close to her oppose the deal. But Post sees something others do not. She grew up in kitchens where women spent hours each day preserving food. Freezing is not just technology, it is the liberation of time, and time is power. The Birdseye acquisition does not simply make Post richer, it reshapes how America eats. Frozen food becomes normal. Supermarkets reorganize. The rhythm of domestic life changes. Postum is renamed General Foods. Marjorie Post becomes one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country, while rarely appearing as its public face. But economic power does not solve everything. Socially, Post remains an outsider. She has money. But Palm Beach belongs to old names families who decide what status looks like. Post attends the parties, but she does not control the room. This creates the second contradiction. She does not want to participate. She wants to define the rules. And this is where the story turns. Early 1920s, Palm Beach, Florida. The stage has already been built by Flagler. Wealth has arrived. Winter has become ritual. But every house here shares the same limitation. They face only one direction. Post wants something else. She brings her corporate mindset to Palm Beach and asks a cold, precise question. If you are going to build, why not build something no one else can have? A residence that does not merely sit on the island, but claims its entire width, from the ocean to the lagoon. That decision will produce the most expensive and most controversial private residence in Palm Beach history. But this is where the story turns. Mar-a-Lago as a machine Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Wuba Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bay, Palm Beach, Florida. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not build Mar-a-Lago as a home to live in. She built it as a social operating system. From the beginning, Post did not look for a single architect. She divided the task into two distinct roles. Marion Sims Wyeth, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, was responsible for structure, proportion, and long-term survival in a tropical climate. Wyeth ensured the building could withstand storms, humidity, and time itself. Joseph Urban, a Viennese stage designer who had created sets for the Metropolitan Opera and Broadway, was given everything else. Urban did not design for living. He designed for impact. Wyeth built the skeleton. Urban shaped the experience. Mar-a-Lago rose on a 17-acre parcel, stretching unbroken from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. A geographic configuration that had become nearly impossible in Palm Beach by then. Beneath the sand lay a natural coral foundation, capable of supporting immense weight. Open ocean to the east, sheltered water to the west. Construction began in Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bon. At its peak, more than 600 workers labored on site. The coral bed was blasted with dynamite. Concrete was poured directly into the rock. 3 ships carrying Dorian limestone arrived from Italy. Urban chose the stone for a precise reason. It aged quickly, giving the new structure the appearance of long-established history. Inside, Post rejected standard solutions. 36,000 antique tiles, many centuries old, were laid by hand, one by one. The interior was not optimized for private living. It was optimized for human flow. Grand entrances created immediate impact. Long corridors stretched the experience. Reception rooms were arranged so crowds could separate and then naturally recombine. Service areas were pushed entirely out of sight. Staff moved continuously without ever entering the guest's visual field. When Mar-a-Lago officially opened in January Mot Ngin Chin Tram Hai Mui Bay, it immediately achieved something Palm Beach had never seen before. Within a single evening, the house could host multiple layers of activity at once. A grand dinner in the ballroom, private conversations in smaller salons, music in one wing, while fundraising or negotiations unfolded in another. Guests never collided. Staff never appeared. Movement happened without instruction. Mar-a-Lago did not simply entertain, it orchestrated. During the winter seasons of the late 1920s, Anyone who mattered socially in Palm Beach appeared here. Industrialists, politicians, diplomats, major patrons of the arts. Mar-a-Lago became a place where relationships were activated, not merely displayed. For a brief period, the estate rewrote Palm Beach's social map. And at the height of that success, a quiet contradiction began to form. Because Mar-a-Lago was never built to close its doors. An ordinary house can sit idle when its owner is absent. Mar-a-Lago cannot. Every space requires staff. Every empty day still generates costs: electricity, maintenance, landscaping, wages. The house functions as designed only when people are inside: music, lighting, movement. When those elements stop, the expenses do not. This structure creates a precise paradox. A building constructed to project power depends entirely on being constantly used. It forces its owner to host, to entertain, to remain present. Mar-a-Lago is not a passive asset. It is a machine. And that machine does not adapt when its operating rhythm slows, when the owner grows tired, when life changes direction, when presence becomes irregular. The house does not shrink, it does not pause, it only becomes heavier. And from this point forward, the question surrounding Mar-a-Lago is no longer about power but about long-term survival. When power reaches its height and begins to push back, Mot ngin chin tram hai moi bay mut, ngin chin tram bay moi bon. Palm Beach, Florida. During the winter seasons of the late 1920s, Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a prominent estate. It became a fixed point on Palm Beach's social calendar. No public invitations were needed. No announcements were required. Anyone who spent the winter in Palm Beach knew exactly where the most consequential evenings took place. Events at Mar-a-Lago were never improvised. Guest lists were carefully arranged. The order of appearances was calculated. Encounters that appeared accidental had usually been planned in advance. Marjorie Post did not remain in one place. She moved constantly through the rooms. A brief introduction. A pause held just long enough. An absence timed with intention. Social power here did not come from speeches, but from the ability to orchestrate people. During this period, Mar-a-Lago accomplished something no other private home could. It became the place where social decisions happened before they appeared at clubs or public functions. Who was brought closer? Who was connected? Who quietly began to drift to the edges? Palm Beach responded. Some long-established families did not stop attending Mar-a-Lago, but they did not fully embrace it either. They appeared less often, more selectively, and at a measured distance. Not because Mar-a-Lago lacked refinement, but because it exposed power structures too clearly, something Palm Beach had long preferred to disguise with subtlety. Then the outside world intervened. October Mongyin Chin Tram Hai Moi Chin, New York City. The stock market collapsed. Within weeks, names that had once appeared regularly in Palm Beach began disappearing from winter schedules. Not always from immediate ruin, but from shifting priorities. Private rail cars were canceled. Entourages were reduced. Winter stays that once lasted 3 months ended several weeks earlier. Palm Beach did not vanish, but its rhythm changed, and Mar-a-Lago felt that change more acutely than anywhere else. A small estate could scale back. Mar-a-Lago could not. As attendance thinned, operating costs did not follow. Silence inside the large rooms became noticeable. Not abandonment, but deliberate emptiness. Marjorie Post continued to host events not to display wealth, but to prevent Mar-a-Lago from losing its central role. At the same time, another shift unfolded in her personal life. Mot ngin chin tram, ba moi lam. The marriage between Marjorie Post and E.F. Hutton ended. The partner who had helped build her economic power and understood the mechanics behind the scenes was no longer present. There was no public scandal, no visible confrontation. But Palm Beach sensed a subtle change. Post's appearances became less consistent. Some seasons she arrived later, left earlier. Mar-a-Lago remained open, but the rhythm was no longer perfectly calibrated. And this is where the story turns. Because Mar-a-Lago was never designed to exist independently of its owner. And for the first time, the question was no longer how magnificent Mar-a-Lago was, but what happens when the center of power is no longer held every day. By the late 1930s, Marjorie Merriweather Post was no longer regularly present in Palm Beach. Not because Mar-a-Lago had failed, but because her role had changed. In Mot ngin chin tram, Bamue Bay, Post married Joseph E. Davies, a lawyer deeply embedded in Washington's political world, with direct connections to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. 2 years later, Davies was appointed United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union, one of the most sensitive diplomatic posts of the pre-war period. Post left Palm Beach, not for a single winter, but for many years in succession. Mar-a-Lago entered a state it had never experienced before. The house remained, but the person who set its rhythm was gone. During her years in Moscow, Post was no longer a social hostess. She became an organizer of diplomatic receptions between the United States and Stalin's government, under constant surveillance, suspicion, and political tension. Post's greatest skill was never architecture. It was the ability to orchestrate people. And that skill was no longer being used at Mar-a-Lago. Meanwhile, the house in Palm Beach had not been designed to wait. Without Post, there was no fixed social calendar, no continuous sequence of large-scale events to sustain its central role. Mar-a-Lago did not collapse immediately. It entered a more dangerous condition: loss of function. After World War II, Marjorie Merriweather Post returned to Palm Beach. Mar-a-Lago was still there, intact, maintained, nearly unchanged in appearance. But the rhythm was different. The winter season no longer automatically revolved around Mar-a-Lago. Social calendars no longer formed around weeks of uninterrupted entertaining. Invitations no longer defaulted to a single address. Palm Beach had learned how to operate without it. Major events shifted to smaller, more controllable spaces. Wealthy families chose venues that were easier to manage, less costly, and less dependent on a single individual. Mar-a-Lago remained an architectural masterpiece, but it was no longer the center of social power. And Post recognized that. Not through a sudden shock, but winter after winter, as the house remained open without reclaiming its former necessity. And it was here that Mar-a-Lago's problems shifted from a social question to a decision that could no longer be avoided. Mot Nginchin Tram, Salmoy, Tam Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Mui Ba, an operational problem no one could avoid Palm Beach, Florida. By the late 1960s, Marjorie Merriweather Post had entered her 80s. At the same time, Mar-a-Lago continued to operate according to the structure designed in the 1920s. Financial records from this period show that the minimum annual cost of maintaining the property exceeded Mot Dohong USD, simply to keep the estate in a usable condition. These costs included permanent staff salaries, maintenance of electrical, water, and climate systems, landscape upkeep, and baseline security. This figure did not decrease when the house was used less frequently. It only declined if the property were shut down entirely, a condition the building's design effectively prevented. Mar-a-Lago was not a residence that could be placed into dormancy. Its room layout, industrial kitchens, service wings, and storage facilities were built for continuous operation. As a result, regardless of the owner's presence, the expenses remained constant. Munginchin Tram, Samoichin, Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Muai, Mut, impossible to inherit, difficult to sell. Palm Beach, Florida. During the same period, Post began reviewing options for transferring ownership. Family inheritance was not viable. None of her children were willing or able to assume responsibility for a property requiring seven-figure annual operating costs. The option of selling the estate was equally complex. Real estate developers saw 17 contiguous acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon, land suitable for subdivision and redevelopment. Preserving the existing structure, however, meant high conservation costs and strict development limitations. Private buyers lacked the capacity to maintain the estate's operational scale without fundamentally altering its character. In this context, demolition was not a remote possibility. Palm Beach had already witnessed the removal of several major estates from the 1920s, after their upkeep costs exceeded their functional value. Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Moi Mot Nginchin Tram, Bay Moi High, proposal to the United States government, Washington, D.C. With private solutions increasingly constrained, Marjorie Post turned to another option, a proposed transfer of Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. The proposal was structured with clear legal terms. Mar-a-Lago would be donated to the federal government for potential use as a winter presidential retreat or a high-level diplomatic venue. The donation included a trust fund providing Motram USD annually to offset initial operating expenses. In Mot Ngin Chin Tram Ba Moi He, the United States Congress approved the acceptance. President Richard Nixon signed the authorizing legislation. From a legal standpoint, Mar-a-Lago officially became federal property. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Bai, Moi Ba Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Bay Moi Tam, operational assessments and withdrawal Palm Beach, Florida. Following the transfer, United States federal agencies conducted operational and security evaluations. The findings indicated that the trust fund covered only approximately 0.5% of annual maintenance costs. The remaining expenses would require ongoing federal budget allocations. Security assessments identified additional issues. Mar-a-Lago bordered public roadways. The surrounding area had not been designed for presidential security. Flight paths from Palm Beach International Airport passed nearby. The coastline remained open and difficult to secure. President Nixon already maintained a private retreat in Key Biscayne. He visited Mar-a-Lago only once during a brief inspection. Subsequent administrations did not incorporate the property into official presidential use. By the late 1970s, the United States government decided to return Mar-a-Lago to the Post family's designated organization. Direct consequences. When Mar-a-Lago re-entered the private market, it carried two distinct labels. From the government's perspective, it was a high-cost asset with limited functional efficiency. From the perspective of potential buyers, it was an operational risk. From this point forward, Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed as a social symbol. It became an economic problem without a clear solution. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Bay Moi, Chin Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi Lam. When Mar-a-Lago returned to the market Palm Beach, Florida, Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Bay Moi Chin, a property returned, but without a destination. By the late 1970s, after the United States government completed the legal process of returning ownership, Mar-a-Lago reverted to the control of the organization representing the Post family. Legally, the property had been released. Market-wise, it entered a vacuum. Mar-a-Lago was listed at Hai Moi Kong USD, including the main structure and 17 contiguous acres, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. This was not an arbitrary figure. It reflected land value, location, and the historical construction cost of the estate. From the beginning, however, the central question was not the purchase price. It was the ability to continue owning it. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Bay Moi, Chin Mon Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi Mot, the problem after purchase. Operational records indicated that the minimum annual cost to maintain Mar-a-Lago remained above Moti Kong USD per year, simply to keep the property in usable condition. This figure did not include major system overhauls, safety upgrades, or renovations required to introduce new functions. For an individual buyer, this was no longer a residence. It was a system requiring continuous operation. For real estate developers, the estate presented a different constraint. Preserving the structure meant unsustainable costs. Subdivision was restricted by preservation rules and by an architectural layout that did not lend itself to division. From the outset, the pool of viable buyers was extremely limited. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi, Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi, agreements that appeared, then disappeared during this period. Mar-a-Lago repeatedly approached completed transactions. Preliminary agreements were drafted. Deposits were discussed, yet at the final due diligence stage, each deal collapsed. Technical assessments identified electrical systems, central air conditioning, roofing, and corrosion protection requiring additional investment estimated in the multiple millions of dollars to meet contemporary safety standards. When purchase price, repair costs, and long-term operating expenses were combined, the total exceeded the threshold that any reasonable use model could justify. In the early 1980s, interest rates in the United States rose sharply. Securing financing for a property that generated no income became nearly impossible. Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi, Ba Mot Ngin Chin Tram Tam Moi Bon, a structure standing still on the island's most valuable land. After repeated transaction failures, Mar-a-Lago entered a phase of minimal operation. Staff was significantly reduced. Sections of the grounds were closed. Landscape and interior maintenance was limited to basic preservation. On-site reports from this period documented deteriorating exterior paint, humidity-related interior damage, and gardens growing beyond strict control. Meanwhile, Palm Beach continued to develop. Land became increasingly scarce. Commercial value per square meter rose steadily year after year. The contrast became unavoidable. One of the island's largest land parcels was effectively frozen by the structure occupying it. Mungin Chintram, Tam Moi Lam. A decision is made with a single administrative signature. A structure long considered untouchable for nearly 6 decades was formally placed on the demolition list. In early Motngin Chintram, Tam Moi Lam, the managing organization concluded that no viable alternative remained. An application for a demolition permit was submitted to Palm Beach authorities. The proposed replacement plan was to subdivide the land for developments more compatible with prevailing market conditions. The permit was approved. At that moment, Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed as a historic estate requiring preservation, but as a structure misaligned with contemporary ownership models. For the first time since its completion in Motngin Highway Bay, the possibility of Mar-a-Lago disappearing entirely became a concrete scenario. But this is where the story turns. At the moment when no path forward seemed to remain, another individual evaluated the property in a fundamentally different way. Donald Trump, in the deal that redefined Mar-a-Lago, Palm Beach, Florida, New York, Tam Moi Lam, when everything was ready to be demolished. By early Tam Moi Lam, Mar-a-Lago was no longer under debate or reconsideration. The demolition permit had been formally filed with Palm Beach authorities. Administrative approvals had been signed. Replacement plans had passed legal review. Under the approved plan, the entire structure would be torn down and the Moi Bay contiguous acres subdivided into smaller residential lots, better aligned with Palm Beach's real estate market at the time. There were no formal objections, no state or federal preservation proposals. No buyers stepping forward to keep the building intact. At this point, Mar-a-Lago was no longer treated as a historic estate. It was evaluated strictly as a structure that could no longer operate efficiently and no longer fit contemporary ownership models. Its value had been recalculated, no longer architectural, no longer symbolic, but as raw land value in one of the most expensive locations in Palm Beach. Preparations for the next phase were already underway. The legal process was complete. The decision had been made. Mar-a-Lago, in practical terms, was counting down the final days of its first life, and it was at that precise moment that a new name appeared in the file. Donald Trump. In Motngin Chintram, Tam Moi Lam, Trump was Chin years old. He had already established a reputation in New York through larger-scale real estate projects, high financial leverage, and unconventional ownership structures. Trump did not come to Palm Beach looking for a winter residence. Nor did he approach Mar-a-Lago as a preservation effort. Records from earlier deals show a pattern. Trump was drawn to assets that had reached a point of deadlock, difficult to sell, expensive to maintain, and abandoned by the mainstream market. Mar-a-Lago met every one of those conditions. It had no buyers, no viable rescue plan, and an approved path toward demolition. To Trump, this was not a weakening asset. It was an asset that had already been sentenced. And that finality created an entirely different strategic opening. Trump did not approach Mar-a-Lago as a historic legacy. He approached it as a strategic asset. What caught Trump's attention was not the Spanish-style architecture or the gold leaf interiors. It was the Moi Bay uninterrupted acres, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. A land configuration that Palm Beach zoning rules would no longer allow to be recreated. Trump understood that even if the building disappeared, the land itself remained irreplaceable. And that realization marked the true beginning of the story. Motngin Chintram, Tam Moi Lam, the deal that did not happen at the negotiating table, Palm Beach, Florida. Donald Trump did not enter Mar-a-Lago with an immediate purchase offer. Instead, he began with a move outside the main file. Directly along the eastern boundary of Mar-a-Lago ran a narrow strip of land facing the Atlantic Ocean. This parcel was not part of Mar-a-Lago, yet it sat precisely on the primary sightline from the estate's loggia and key living spaces. The land was owned by Jack Massey, the businessman who built Kentucky Fried Chicken into a national franchise. Trump approached Massey before returning to the Mar-a-Lago negotiations. In Motngin Chintram Tam Moi Lam, Trump purchased this beachfront strip for approximately high million US dollars. In terms of size, the parcel was modest. In strategic terms, it was decisive. Trump then announced plans to construct a residence on the newly acquired land. If carried out, the building would directly block the ocean view from Mar-a-Lago, not with a fence, not through litigation, but with a legally permitted structure. In Palm Beach, the value of coastal real estate is not defined by acreage alone. It is defined by the horizon. Once the horizon disappears, property value collapses with it. And here the balance of power began to shift. The Post Foundation understood the implications immediately. If Trump built on that parcel, Mar-a-Lago would lose more than symbolic value. It would lose its marketability altogether. No investor would purchase a property long marketed as from sea to lake, only to stand inside and face another man's roof. Negotiations reopened. This time, Trump was no longer the buyer seeking approval. He was the party controlling the bottleneck. Mungin Chintram, Tam Moilam. When the numbers broke, the Post Foundation had originally listed Mar-a-Lago at $1 million US. That figure reflected its architectural significance, historic status, and original construction costs estimated to exceed $1 million in modern terms. By late Mont Ngin Chintram Tam Moilam, the question was no longer, what is it worth? It had become, who would still dare to buy it? Previous contracts had collapsed. Annual maintenance exceeded $1 million. Demolition permits were already approved. Trump submitted a revised offer. According to varying contemporary accounts, the total transaction value fell between Bay and $1 million US, including both the real estate and the contents inside. Trump later wrote that he paid $9 million for the land and structure and $1 million for the furnishings. Some press reports at the time cited slightly higher totals, but all agree on one point. The final price was dramatically below the original listing. More striking still, independent appraisals valued the interior furnishings alone at approximately $10 million US. In other words, the contents of Mar-a-Lago by themselves nearly equaled the entire purchase price. The deal closed in late Motngin Chintram Tam Moi Lam. The demolition permit was never executed. Motngin Chintram Tam Moi saw when Mar-a-Lago opened its eyes again. Trump did not purchase Mar-a-Lago to preserve it unchanged. Immediately after taking control, he initiated a comprehensive restoration. Roofs were repaired, mechanical systems replaced, neglected gardens were cleared and replanted. Ivan Trump personally oversaw interior restoration. Specialized artisans were brought in. Gold leaf, murals, and antique tiles were cleaned, stabilized, and repaired. After nearly a decade of dormancy, Mar-a-Lago returned to active use. But Trump quickly encountered a structural problem. Operating costs did not disappear. The estate had been designed for a social model that no longer existed. And this is where the story turns again. Because the solution Trump chose was not to shrink Mar-a-Lago, but to reinvent entirely how it would survive. Mot Ngin Chin Tram, Tam Moi, Bay Mot Ngin, Chin Tram, Chin Moi, Bai, when Mar-a-Lago became a gamble Palm Beach, Florida. Within a year of restoring Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump confronted a reality he could not avoid. The estate could not sustain itself. According to operating records from the late 1980s, the annual cost of maintaining Mar-a-Lago ranged between high and below $1 million US, including staffing, maintenance, security, landscaping, and taxes. Even for an asset acquired at a discount, a prolonged negative cash flow was a serious risk. Trump tried the first option. He proposed subdividing the property, selling off portions of the land to offset operating expenses. The proposal was rejected by the Palm Beach Town Council. Mar-a-Lago had been classified as a property of special historic value. Subdivision would have destroyed the continuous spatial layout from ocean to lagoon that defined the site. Trump moved to a second option. He proposed a change in use. Under the new plan, Mar-a-Lago would no longer function as a single-family residence. It would become a private membership club, with members paying fees to access spaces previously reserved for one household. The proposal divided the community. Palm Beach had long operated as a tightly controlled enclave. Its social clubs enforced strict, unwritten rules governing membership, background, and religion. A Mar-a-Lago club would disrupt that order. Local officials feared increased traffic. Residents worried about outsiders. Established clubs viewed the plan as a direct challenge. Meetings stretched on for months. Documents moved back and forth. Conditions were added, then removed. Bedroom counts were capped. Membership numbers restricted. And then the story turned again. Mot ngin chin tram chin moi, mot ngin chin tram chin moi, mot a crisis that forced the bet New York, Atlantic City, Palm Beach. While negotiations in Palm Beach stalled, Trump faced a far greater threat elsewhere. In the early 1990s, his real estate empire was pulled into a credit crisis. 3 casinos in Atlantic City were losing money. Trump Taj Mahal opened in Mot Ngin Chin Tram Chin Moi with more than tam tram million US dollars in debt and quickly failed to generate sufficient cash flow. Banks began tightening credit. Total personal and corporate debt linked to Trump was estimated to exceed B billion US dollars at the peak of the crisis. Trump was forced to sell his private jet, sell his yacht, renegotiate loan after loan. In that context, Mar-a-Lago was no longer a symbol. It was a financial liability bleeding cash. But for that very reason, it became a final bargaining chip. Without a change in use, Mar-a-Lago would continue to drain resources. With approval, it could generate stable cash flow from membership fees, events, and services. Trump returned to negotiations with Palm Beach authorities. This time, there was little room left to delay. Mutngin Chin Tram Chin Moi Ba, the decision that changed everything. Palm Beach, Florida. After multiple rounds of revisions, an agreement was approved in Mutngin Chin Tram Chin Moi Ba. Trump was permitted to operate Mar-a-Lago as a private membership club under specific conditions. Membership was capped. Private residential areas were separated. Commercial activities were tightly regulated. It was not an absolute victory, but it was enough for Mar-a-Lago to survive. And that was the moment the gamble took a visible form. Because this decision did not merely save an estate, it fundamentally altered Mar-a-Lago's role in American social life. Yet the real question remained unanswered. Could a place designed for one individual continue to function as a stage for hundreds? And could Trump control the consequences of that choice? The answer only emerged after the club doors opened. Mot ngin chin tram chin moi la mot ngin chin tram chin moi chin. When the doors opened and the old order was challenged, Palm Beach, Florida. In Mot ngin chin tram chin moi lam, Mar-a-Lago officially reopened as a private membership club. The new operating model was designed around a single problem: cash flow. The initial initiation fee was set at high Moi lam US dollars per member. Annual dues added several $1,000s more each year. Membership numbers were capped under agreements with local authorities. Donald Trump's private residential quarters were completely separated from the club's public areas. From a financial standpoint, the model began to work quickly. Within the first few years, membership fees and social events covered most of the operating costs that had once pushed Mar-a-Lago to the brink of demolition. But conflict did not come from the balance sheet. The first reactions came from groups that never appeared in any legal filing. Longtime residents of Palm Beach began raising concerns about increased traffic. Evening events ran later than before. New faces appeared in a place long accustomed to stability and seclusion. At the same time, traditional social clubs expressed a concern more discreetly. Mar-a-Lago, unlike them, did not apply the unwritten criteria that had shaped Palm Beach society for decades. Membership records show that the club accepted members without regard to religion and did not enforce background barriers once considered unwritten standards. Pressure gradually shifted toward the local government, not through protests, not through public complaints, but through administrative action. Between Mot ngin chin tram chin moi sao and Mot ngin chin tram chin moi bay, the town of Palm Beach issued a series of additional regulations applied specifically to Mar-a-Lago. Event hours were restricted. Guest limits were imposed on private functions. Staffing and operational requirements were inspected with noticeably greater frequency than at other clubs in the area. Formally, these measures were justified as efforts to protect community order. But when operating practices were compared, a discrepancy became clear. Other long-established clubs continued to exclude members based on religion or background, yet did not face comparable levels of oversight. And this is where the story turns. In Mot ngin chin tram chin moi bay, Donald Trump filed a lawsuit against the town of Palm Beach. The case did not center on business rights alone. It raised a broader issue: consistency in the application of the law. Trump argued that Mar-a-Lago was subjected to stricter limitations because of its open membership model, while other clubs with documented histories of exclusion were not held to the same standards. The lawsuit immediately drew attention, not because of property value, but because it exposed social structures that had operated quietly for decades. Civil rights organizations began to speak out. National media outlets placed Palm Beach at the center of a wider debate over discrimination within America's elite social institutions. Local authorities could no longer treat the matter as a routine administrative dispute. A series of closed-door negotiations followed. Eventually, the case was settled out of court. Certain restrictions on Mar-a-Lago were revised. The club continued operating under a new legal framework. But from that moment forward, Mar-a-Lago was no longer just a private club. It had become a public point of collision between wealth, power, and an older social order. Motngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Chin Nam, when Mar-a-Lago moved beyond the role of a club, Palm Beach, Florida. After the Motngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Bay lawsuit was settled, Mar-a-Lago was no longer operating in a defensive legal posture. Its regulatory framework was established. Administrative boundaries were clarified. The club entered a period of stability, and within that stability, Mar-a-Lago's role began to shift. By the late 1990s, what set Mar-a-Lago apart was no longer its amenities or its membership fees. It was who appeared there. Events became more frequent. Not just social gatherings, but meetings where figures from business, entertainment, and broader circles of influence shared the same closed space. Rooms originally designed by Marjorie Post to host heads of the state and diplomats were once again serving their original function, but without state authority. This was informal diplomacy, and this is where a new variable entered the story. High, when attention extended beyond Palm Beach, Florida. Increased activity brought increased visibility from outside. Media references to Mar-a-Lago no longer centered on disputes, but on the recurring presence of familiar names. Mar-a-Lago ceased to be a purely internal social address of Palm Beach. It began to be perceived as a meeting place capable of shaping relationships. That shift introduced a quiet tension. A place whose value depended on controlling access was now gaining influence through how often it was mentioned. Not everyone welcomed the change. Local authorities began to review certain licensing provisions already in place. Not to shut Mar-a-Lago down, but to determine whether it was operating strictly as a club or as a space whose influence exceeded its original mandate. Administrative discussions followed. This time they were no longer confrontational. Mar-a-Lago had entered a different position. When a private space became a public symbol, Palm Beach of Florida. In the early 2000s, Mar-a-Lago appeared with increasing frequency in national media contexts. Not because of legal battles, not because of financial distress, but because of the events held inside. Large-scale parties, lavish weddings, gatherings that connected multiple layers of influence. In Nam, Donald Trump's wedding to Melania Knauss was held at Mar-a-Lago. The event drew hundreds of guests, was closely followed by international media, and made one point unmistakably clear. Mar-a-Lago was no longer a property saved by a club model. It had become a public-facing symbol actively in use. Yet that visibility revealed its central contradiction. A place designed to control presence now depended on attention. And when attention became the primary source of power, the question was no longer whether Mar-a-Lago could survive. It became, what would it be used for next? The answer did not come from Palm Beach. It came from a much larger stage. Hai Nguyen Chin, Hai Nguyen Mui Lam, when Mar-a-Lago entered the political orbit. Palm Beach, Florida. The global financial crisis of Hai Nguyen Tom shook many of the world's traditional centers of power. Wall Street contracted. Washington faced instability. Public confidence in long-standing institutions weakened. In that context, Mar-a-Lago did not shut down. On the contrary, it continued operating steadily. But the shift was not in the event calendar. It was in who began to appear there. From Hai Nguyen Chin to Hai Nguyen Mui Hai, Mar-a-Lago saw increasingly frequent visits from politically connected business figures, campaign donors, and individuals operating on the edges of formal power structures. These were not public meetings. There were no minutes, no official statements, only dinners, private gatherings, and conversations taking place outside institutional oversight. Mar-a-Lago did not become a political headquarters, but it began functioning as a transitional space where relationships were formed before appearing on the public stage. And this is where a new tension emerged. Hai Nguyen Mui, Mot Haingin Mui, but private space and public power Palm Beach, Florida. Legally, Mar-a-Lago remained a private club. In practice, the interactions inside were no longer purely social. The presence of figures linked to policy, finance, and media blurred the boundary between private life and public power. No laws were broken, no regulations violated. Yet observers began asking a quiet question. Can a private space function as a conduit of power without being subject to the same scrutiny as public institutions? Mar-a-Lago did not answer that question. It remained open, and that silence only increased its appeal. Haingin Moibon. When power and image converged Palm Beach, Florida, New York. In Haingin Moibon, Donald Trump appeared more frequently in public political discussions. His statements drew media attention. Polling scenarios began to include his name as a potential political actor. At the same time, Mar-a-Lago was increasingly referenced as where Trump returned, not the White House, not Washington, but a private property outside the traditional centers of power. This combination produced a notable paradox. A figure moving toward politics while positioning himself outside the system. A private space becoming progressively public in function. And this is where the story shifts again. Haingin Moilam, before the political door fully opened Palm Beach, Florida. Before Donald Trump formally announced his presidential candidacy, Mar-a-Lago had already completed a quiet transformation, from a mansion once slated for demolition to a controversial club, then a social stage, and finally an informal gathering point for political power. No administrative decision assigned it this role, no legal document defined it, but meetings had taken place, relationships had been built, lines of influence had formed. And the question at this point was no longer where Mar-a-Lago was headed. It became, when formal politics begins, can a place designed to control access remain outside the spotlight? The answer would only emerge when Donald Trump crossed another boundary. A boundary that would no longer allow Mar-a-Lago to remain just a club. Haingin Moilam Haingin Hai Moimot. When Mar-a-Lago became the winter White House Palm Beach, Florida in June, Haingin Moilam, Donald Trump announced his candidacy for President of the United States. From that moment, Mar-a-Lago was no longer a peripheral backdrop. It began to appear directly within the flow of national politics. Haingin Moi. So a private space enters a public campaign, Palm Beach, Florida, Washington, D.C. Throughout the Haingin Moiso campaign, Mar-a-Lago continued to operate as a private membership club. But the nature of what occurred inside had changed. Political fundraising events, meetings with major donors, closed-door discussions with figures preparing to enter a future administration. There were no formal announcements, no publicly released schedules. Yet travel between Mar-a-Lago and Washington became increasingly frequent. And this is where a contradiction began to take shape. Haingin Moi Bay, when public power operated in a private space Palm Beach, Florida. In January, Haingin Moi Bay, Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. During the first year of his term, Mar-a-Lago was used as a working and hosting location outside Washington. Meetings with foreign leaders, briefings with senior advisors, policy discussions held within the grounds of a privately owned property. According to publicly available records, in Haingin Moi Bay alone, Trump spent more than Ba Moi days at Mar-a-Lago while serving as president. Federal security costs for each stay were estimated to reach millions of US dollars. And this is where the story takes a sharper turn. Haingin Moi Bay, Haingin Moi Tam, ethical tensions and public reaction, Palm Beach, Florida. Legally, Mar-a-Lago remained a privately owned property operating as a fee-based club. In practice, it became a space directly associated with public authority. Members could dine within the same compound where foreign policy matters were being discussed. Several controversial moments followed. Information about informal meetings surfaced through social media. Images from inside the club appeared, while national security issues were under consideration. The question was no longer theoretical. It became a public debate. Can state power be exercised within a space accessible only to those who can pay for entry? Haingin Moi Chin Haingin Hai Moi. When a symbol became a point of division, Palm Beach, Florida. From Haingin Moi Chin, Mar-a-Lago was no longer referenced simply as a presidential retreat. It became a politically polarizing symbol. Supporters viewed it as the image of a leader operating outside the traditional elite circles. Critics cited Mar-a-Lago as a clear example of blurred boundaries between public office and private interest. Small demonstrations appeared outside the property gates. International media outlets frequently referenced Mar-a-Lago in discussions of governmental ethics. And then, a global disruption arrived. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Mot, when power departed and the space remained Palm Beach, Florida. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted nearly all social activity at Mar-a-Lago. Events were canceled. Club operations were scaled back. In January, Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Mot, Donald Trump's presidential term ended. No official announcement defined a new role for Mar-a-Lago. But one thing was clear. Formal power departed. The space remained. Mar-a-Lago returned to its status as a private property. Yet the imprint of the preceding years did not disappear. It had once been a mansion slated for demolition, a controversial club, a social stage, and for a defined period, an informal center of power. And this still does not explain the core question. What happens when a space designed to control access becomes a site where power is exercised publicly? The answer does not lie in a single term. It lies in the legacy Mar-a-Lago carries after power has moved on. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi, Mot Hai Nguyen Hai Moi, born after power Palm Beach, Florida. In January, Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Mot, Donald Trump left the White House and returned to Mar-a-Lago. From that moment, the role of the property shifted again. It was no longer a center of executive power, but it did not return to being an ordinary social club. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi, Mo Power Without Office, Palm Beach, Florida. Throughout Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Mot, Mar-a-Lago became a frequent destination for Republican politicians, major donors, and figures with internal influence. There were no official titles, no formal authority, but meetings continued. Decisions about endorsements and campaign strategy were discussed inside a private space. And this is where the pace accelerates. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Hai, from power space to investigation site, Palm Beach, Florida. In August, Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Hai, federal agents executed a search at Mar-a-Lago. The investigation concerned the handling of documents after Trump left office. Government vehicles at the gate. Security perimeters tightened. Continuous media presence. Mar-a-Lago shifted from a symbol of power to a public investigation site, and this became an irreversible turning point. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi, Ba stretch symbol, Palm Beach, Florida. After the Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Hai search, Mar-a-Lago did not fade from political life. Instead, it became a sharply polarized symbol. For one side, it functioned as a political hub. For the other, it illustrated blurred boundaries between personal power and public responsibility. No consensus emerged, but attention only increased. Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Bon, an unanswered question. Palm Beach, Florida, by Hai Nguyen Hai Moi Bon. Mar-a-Lago was no longer viewed through a single individual. It had become a case study, a private space that carried multiple roles over time, none of which were designed to supervise the power exercised inside. And the final question is no longer about Trump. It is about the space itself. Did power disappear, or did it simply change form? Mar-a-Lago has never answered, and its role may not be finished yet. Mar-a-Lago still stands today. Not collapsed, not erased, but no longer the place its creator once imagined. It was born as a display of wealth, then became a social instrument, later a strategic asset, and eventually a contested symbol. Not because of its architecture, not because of gold, stone, or acreage, but because of what has happened, what is still happening, and what may yet happen inside it. The story of Mar-a-Lago is not really about a building. It is about how power moves, about how money can reshape the fate of a space, and about how fragile the line between private property and public influence can become in a changing era. Some places are not built to rule, yet they become centers of influence. And some structures, even after losing their original purpose, continue to shape the story of their time. Mar-a-Lago is one of them. If you want to explore further how estates, spaces, and private assets created to project power often end up with far more complex destinies, the videos on screen will take the story even further. For now, if this story gave you something to think about, leave a comment and share your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep following stories about power, money, and the spaces that shaped history. See you in the next video.